Hello and welcome to the Meet the Parents podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 68 of the Meet the Parents podcast and another week of parent-based chat. I'm Tim from Slouching Towards Thatcham, and tonight I'm joined by Mark from Best Dad I Can Be. Good evening, Mark.
Hi, Tim. A very select group or duo this evening, eh?
Small and perfectly formed. This week we're going to talk about how to help our kids become successful and about heading off to university. Now, I saw an article online last week titled, "Science Says the Most Successful Kids Have Parents Who Do These 9 Things." Now, obviously, as a parent who would quite like their kids to be successful in whatever they do in their future lives, I clicked on it. So, in answer to the question, what can I do to make sure my kids succeed in life? These are apparently the 9 things we need to do as parents, according to a variety of researchers. Now, it's predominantly US-based research, but I would imagine the conclusions are still pretty valid across most developed countries at least. So we're going to run through these one at a time and quickly comment on what we think of each of them. So number 1, don't tell them they can be anything they want. Research apparently shows that teenagers aspire to be musicians, athletes or video game designers, even though these kinds of jobs represent just 1% of jobs. Why not steer them into highly paid professions where there are lots of jobs? Now, I have to admit, I'm torn on this one a little bit. I think we should absolutely encourage our kids to dream, but equally I think we should ensure they view their dreams through a lens of realism and with a view to keeping their options open as much as they can at least. But the world would be a really dull place if we all pointed our kids towards the careers that gave them the best chance of well-paid employment. There has to be some kind of a balance, surely, which allows them to be happy rather than focusing purely on materialism and job security. Having said that, if Isaac suddenly decides tomorrow that he wants to be a professional footballer, I will be investing a lot of time in gently pointing out to him that he will need more than 2 left feet. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, should we tell our children that they can do whatever they want to do? I think in many cases the children are wiser than we give them credit for, and they come to realise that they can't do everything that they perhaps dreamed of because they just don't have the talent for it. I often think that you see people on the X Factor and somebody should have actually just been a little bit kind and took them on one side and said, actually, you can't sing, don't save yourself this embarrassment. I was a particularly sort of realistic parent in that I consciously didn't tell my children that everything they did was wonderful. It's a bit like a travel writer. If you say everything's wonderful, then ultimately nothing is wonderful. So while I was, always giving my kids praise and encouraging them, I did feel that you had to temper it with realism, because if you tell your child that every single thing they do is wonderful, when they actually do something that's amazing, you've got nowhere left to go. Particularly with Eleanor and her writing, I wasn't averse to saying, actually, that's not quite as good as you could do if you just went back to your bedroom and spent, another half hour on it.
Yeah, you could write a book on that, couldn't you? You could call it something like 50 Shades of Praise.
It's very good, 50 Shades of Praise. I like that. I'll just log off for 30 seconds while I just check whether anybody's got 50shadesofpraise.com. Yeah.
Moving on to number 2. They recommend eating dinner as a family. Kids who eat with their families roughly 5 days a week apparently exhibit lower levels of substance abuse, teen pregnancy, obesity and depression. And they also tend to end up with better grades, vocabularies and self-esteem. Mark, do you find that surprising at all?
Not in the slightest. I do question whether eating together causes those things, or whether it's the fact that families who eat together are also likely to, you know what I'm saying. I don't think that necessarily eating together automatically causes better grades on its own. I do think that eating together as a family is absolutely essential. Yes, we did it. We did it every single day. And number one, it's a great chance to talk to your kids. because, as I always say, if you can't talk to your kids when they're 6, 7 and 8, you've got absolutely no chance when they're 16, 17 and 18. And also, eating together is great fun.
Yeah, and I agree. I think this feels like a real no-brainer for me. So, number 3, enforce no screen time. Too much tablet and smartphone time can impede a child's ability to focus and develop vocabulary and social skills. Restrict screen time and make the dinner table, the car and bedrooms media-free zones. So, what do you think to that, Mark?
I don't think we ever did that. I can't remember that we had strict no screen time. We did make the dinner table a mobile-free zone. Long car journeys, no, that they weren't. They were. I mean, I used to insist that we did quizzes in the car. Honestly, Tim, what's the education system coming to? I thought the family would have a great time going through all 92 Football League teams being quizzed on their nicknames, but the children didn't seem even remotely interested. So, we didn't score very highly on that one, I'm afraid, but certainly the dinner table was an absolute mobile-free zone.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that's quite common now in a lot of households, where otherwise you would just stare at your phones and never speak to each other. And I think, as with many things, I think a lot of it is about moderation. And there are actually recent research studies that completely contradict, the view that's given here. And they tend to focus on ensuring that you have quality rather than quantity of screen time. And I agree with that. I think the no screen time rule is way too simplistic. Absolutely, we don't want our kids to spend their entire lives in front of a screen. But equally, they're engaging in what will inevitably be a key skill for future life. And if one of the kids spends 2 hours researching a homework project, then that for me is time well spent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Number 4, work outside the home. Targeted more at mums than dads typically, I guess, but when mums work outside the home as opposed to being stay-at-home mums, their daughters are more likely to be employed and make more money than peers whose mothers did not have careers. Now, I'm not entirely convinced about this. I think a lot of it is about attitude, it's about openness, and it's about setting a good example. I think a good stay-at-home mum can demonstrate the value that an at-home mum can offer while still opening a daughter's or a son's eyes to the possibilities that having a career can have. And, is a household where the mum's working 12-hour days and doesn't spend any time at all with the kids that great a role model anyway?
Yeah, I mean, we've always tried to share the parenting duties. I mean, my wife works at a reasonably high level in the NHS, so in many ways, my job has been much more flexible than hers, as I think, quite a few parents on this podcast have that sort of arrangement.
Yeah, so moving on, number 5, make them work. A study shows that people who achieved the greatest professional success tended to do more chores when they were children. Do you know, I don't care whether this is true or not. I mean, our kids have been brought up to expect to do a certain level of household jobs, partly for pocket money and partly actually just to be contributing members of the household. If they do chores, also, it has the added benefit that we have more time for wine, and I'm struggling to see the downside of it.
Yeah, you and me both. I mean, the other thing that I am a big advocate of is summer jobs. Alex, in particular, got a job when he was 16 as a waiter. He carried on doing that job all the way through his A-levels, working one, occasionally 2 nights a week. And I thought that was a fantastic thing for him to do. Apart from earning some money, it gave him experience of work. It gave him experience of human nature. He learned a lot about that. Came home on his last night and said to me, have you heard of somebody called Barry Cryer, Dad? And I said, yes, I've spent a lot of my life listening to Barry Cryer on the Radio Y. And he said, he was in the hotel tonight and I was chatting to him. And that's a really good thing to do. I'm a huge advocate of summer jobs.
Number 6 is about delaying gratification. So children who learn not to give in to temptation immediately grow up with better social skills, higher test scores, and they tend to be better able to deal with stress. Mark, how do you feel about that?
Well, that's the strawberry principle, isn't it? Interesting to see it in your own children, that the ability to delay gratification. So yeah, I can't do it. Obviously, if I see a bottle of wine, I have to open it immediately. It's something to look for in young children. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's even more important nowadays than when I was a child, as we live in a world of increasingly instant gratification, instant credit that allows us to buy things now, being able to watch TV on demand, all that stuff that technology enables. And it's a useful lesson, I think, to know that sometimes the best things in life have to be earned.
It's like saving up for things, isn't it? I think if you can get some money management skills into your children and show them that occasionally things need to be saved for as opposed to appearing instantly. I remember a couple of times when the kids have wanted something and said, well, you could buy this for us and we could pay you back out of our allowance or whatever. And we'd said, no, just save up for it. Put the money on one side, and you will appreciate it when it eventually arrives.
Yeah, absolutely. Number 7, read to them. Babies whose parents read to them have better language, literacy and early reading skills. And kids who like books when they're little tend to grow into people who read for fun later on, which has its own set of associated benefits. And frequent readers generally achieve better results as well. Now, do we need to discuss this one, Mark? It's the brainiest of no-brainers, isn't it?
It's reading to my children was the greatest pleasure of being a dad for me. I miss it absolutely. I can't wait to have a 4-year-old granddaughter who I will read to incessantly.
Moving on to the final couple now. So number 8 is encourage them to travel. So teachers say students who experience international travel have increased tolerance of other cultures and ethnicities, are more curious and more adaptable. And apparently even encouraging domestic travel can accrue similar benefits. So Mark, something you agree with?
Absolutely. Just taking them out. And the other thing that I absolutely believe in is if you're taking them to France or Spain, make sure they can say a few words of French or Spanish and get them to try and speak a different language.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we always do. And having just come back from a big European road trip this summer, I'm very conscious about wanting to set a good example. So when we're in, France, Germany, Italy, wherever, I'm very conscious about wanting to be able to at least begin conversations in the local language, even if you falter after a couple of sentences and give in to the waiter who speaks perfect English, holding the conversation in English for you. But it's
not difficult to take even a 6, 7, 8-year-old child into a bread shop and order some bread rolls in Spanish, is it, or in French? That's not a difficult thing to do. And however good or bad your accent might be, you can at least make an effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that goes a long way with locals. They do appreciate the effort that's made, even if your level of competence perhaps doesn't match that effort.
Yeah.
And last but by no means least, number 9, let them fail. So experiencing failure helps your child learn to cope. It builds resilience and it instills the need for hard work. Also, constantly rescuing your child can send them the message that you don't necessarily trust them. I'm actually quite a big believer in this last one. Give your kids a chance to fail in small ways that don't damage them too much, either physically or psychologically. But, it gives them the opportunity to learn. It builds independence, it builds trust. And if you're constantly mollycoddling your child, who is it you're really protecting anyway? This is an argument that I have with my mother on quite a regular basis. Now, she comes from a very well-meaning place, but her instinct is always to help. And I've regularly had to stop her doing things for the kids that fall into, they tip over into that category of smothering and mollycoddling in my eyes. So where do you stand on that, Mark?
Oh, I'm absolutely with you on that. And besides which, sooner or later, they're going to go into the world of work and they're not going to get their own way on everything, are they? Your children cannot succeed all the time. You cannot tell them that everything they do is wonderful. It's just not real life.
Again, it comes back to... You want your kids to be, to be optimistic. You want them to feel confident and to, build that confidence. But you can't overdo it by telling them, things that just aren't truthful. And to hide the truth from them, ultimately, I think there may be some short-term gain in it, but long-term it comes back to bite you. I guess we've agreed on pretty much all of those, which I think says actually that I think a lot of them are almost to a large extent stating the obvious, but one final question for me that maybe is a little bit less clear, and because one thing the article doesn't really address directly is actually what the definition of success is. Is it financial success? Is it happiness and well-being? Is it the achievement of specific life goals? I mean, Mark, how would you want to define success for your kids?
Ultimately, are they doing something that makes them happy? Are they doing something that makes them fulfilled? Let me give you an example. Daniel went all through his teenage years wanting to be an aerodynamicist in the Formula One industry, okay, which sounds like one of the most glamorous careers you can pursue. So Dan went to Cambridge, he got a first in engineering, he got a job with the Formula One team, went off to Brackley in Northamptonshire to work, was there for 6 months, and he gave it up. He left because he just changed, and while he was at Cambridge, he developed a social conscience. He cares very deeply about the environment, about global warming. So he has just in the past couple of weeks started at Leeds University doing a PhD in applying aerodynamic principles to climate change. Is that success? It is giving up a job in Formula One where he was earning quite a good salary for a graduate to go back to doing a PhD. It certainly is success for him. And if it's success for him because it's exactly what he wants to do, because he wants to make a contribution using his skills, then it's success for us as well. It may not be what he wanted to do when he was younger. It's what he wants to do now. And that strikes me as a pretty working definition of success.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point because it underlines that different people will have different definitions of success, and actually, as you grow and your life experience changes you a little bit, your own definition of success might end up being something very different to what it was to begin with. And as parents, we do have an important role to play in that, don't we? To help children define what success means to them, whether it's by the example of their own careers or their values or the things they do.
As a definition of success, does your child become a useful member of society, and are they happy?
And I guess on that philosophical note, let's move on. If the beginning of September is about back to school, then the latter half of the month is about back to university, or in the case of Alex, off to university. Now, this is a topic that is of significant future interest to me, as I'm sure it is to other parents with school-aged kids. Now, all three of our kids are pretty academic, and while university isn't the only option for them when they reach 18, realistically, it's probably quite a likely one. So Mark, you've just last week moved Alex up to his new university. So where's he studying and what is he studying? Okay,
so his first choice was Edinburgh to do history, which is what he's always wanted to do. So he got that. He got A star in history, an A and a couple of Bs. So he went off to Edinburgh where he's doing a 4-year MA in history.
All three of your kids have followed in your footsteps in terms of going on to university. So how does it make you feel that all three of them have gone on into further education? Was it something you particularly wanted for them or encouraged them, or did they not need any encouragement?
I think like yours, Tim, that the kids were always quite academic. It's what they all wanted to do, so that's great. It makes me feel slightly envious because I'm going to be pushed right down to the bottom of the family qualification league, I'm afraid. You do go to university for the academic qualifications, but there are other things that you go for as well. And it was the right thing for my three to do. Don't necessarily say it's the right thing for all children to do, but for my three, it was the right thing to do.
And my dad moved away from Malaysia to attend university in Sydney, and I was the first from our family to go to university in the UK. So it was a big thing. It must be said I wasn't an overwhelming success academically, mostly due to me being too busy having too much fun, and if I'm being truthful, probably not being mature enough to really handle the responsibility and the freedom. I was at university at actually quite a pivotal time. Tuition fees were covered, and students could also get a maintenance grant that covered living expenses, or at least a good chunk of them anyway. At the beginning of my second year was when student loans were introduced in the UK. Now, at first, you could only borrow something like, I think it was £500 or £600, and then it gradually stepped up from there year after year. So I left uni with a debt of something like £1,500 that I paid back at the princely rate of £25 a month over 5 years. Yeah, not too bad in terms of debt. But nowadays, the situation is somewhat different with, I think maintenance grants now are only for students from low-income households, and then it's student loans to cover everything else. So Mark, how does that work, and what's the implication for the amount of debt that a student can expect to have accrued by the end of their degree?
Fees for most courses now are around £9,000 a year. They will also have a maintenance loan of, I think Alex's is just over 3,600, because he said to us that he worked out he got about £1,200 a term. For a 3-year course now, you can probably say that the children will graduate with debts of between £40,000 and £50,000.
Which is a pretty sizable amount of debt to move into the working world with.
It is eye-watering. Repayments don't start until they are earning more than £21,000 a year. But you may have seen controversy in the paper recently when the interest rate on student loans went up, because it's linked to inflation. And I think I feel very, very strongly that that the student loan regime is just fundamentally flawed. It's got to be overhauled at some stage. Let me very quickly, Tim, just do some mental arithmetic with you. If your child has a student loan debt of £50,000, which is absolutely not unusual now, that they will be paying interest on that debt at 6%. So £3,000 of interest is payable on £50,000. If they are earning £30,000 a year, which would be a pretty good salary, a couple of years after graduating, they will be making repayments of approximately £800 a year. Now, you will very quickly realise that if you are making repayments of £800, but you have got interest of £3,000, your debt is actually increasing. That seems to me fundamentally, ethically wrong, that the government has set up a student loan regime where you can absolutely meet your contractual obligations but still see your level of debt increasing. The simple fact, I think, is that the vast majority of today's students will not repay their student loans, but will in fact just pay a graduate tax for most of their working life.
I mean, obviously this is something that as a parent you feel particularly strongly about, but is there anything that you have had to do or that you've chosen to do to help prepare your children and mitigate the financial impact of this?
What we're doing is that we are paying their accommodation costs. Alex's accommodation at Edinburgh is £5,000 a year. Eleanor's accommodation at Sheffield wasn't much cheaper. Dan's accommodation at Cambridge was significantly cheaper because the Cambridge colleges are so rich that they can afford to subsidise the accommodation. Alex is in a fairly new block. It's purpose-built. He's got a very nice ensuite room, 5 of them in a sort of flat with a communal kitchen between the 5 of them. But it's £5,000 for the year, and I'm guessing that next year, when he perhaps shares a house with some friends, it will be something similar. we're trying to do that just so that the kids don't graduate with appalling levels of debt as opposed to horrendous levels of debt. Paying accommodation bills for three of them is an expensive business. I would absolutely, in terms of financial planning, for any parent who thinks that their child might go to university, I would say start to save for it, even if you're only saving 10, 20, 30 quid a month, because you will need the money at the end of the day.
And things really have changed, haven't they? Because from a financial perspective, in my day, well, in both our days, it was an easy decision whether or not to go to university, because on average someone with a degree would earn much more over their lifetime than someone who left full-time education at 16 or 18. So if you were able to get the grades you needed, odds are you would choose to go to university. But now it's less clear cut, with graduates leaving with 40,000-50,000 pounds worth of debt, as you say, and also more graduates these days are struggling to find graduate level entry jobs than ever before. So is this kind of thing something that ever came up in discussion in your household, particularly given that, like us, you've had 3 kids to worry about?
Interestingly, I did some work for one of the newer universities. I actually wrote the university prospectus for one of them. That was Coventry University, who have a campus in Scarborough. That's very much vocational degrees, so an entirely different style of university, a university where you are not, where the fees are lower and where there's a real understanding that students may need to work while they're at university, that they may not want to graduate with a huge burden of debt. The other thing that we talked about was apprenticeships and things like that. Alex has a friend who came from a family of accountants who knew he wanted to be an accountant. Rather than go to university, he has been awarded an accountancy apprenticeship with one of the big accountancy firms. He will be earning while he's getting his qualifications. Increasingly, parents and schools need to be aware of alternatives to university.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more and more so these days, university is not the only option, and in some cases it's not the best option.
I was hugely impressed by the model Coventry had for study, and I think if you've a child who really knows what they want to do, some of the universities that use perhaps a different model, where there's perhaps the option to live at home or the option to work while you're getting a degree, they are well worthy of consideration. You might miss out on some of the student union, the sports activities, something like that. But everything comes at a price, doesn't it?
As we were talking about just now, we were saying that university isn't necessarily the only option. In this country at least, I think there's a certain snobbery towards things like apprenticeships that you mentioned just now, where people consider them inferior and only for people who aren't smart enough to go to university, whereas that isn't necessarily the case at all. Because I've seen, working with a lot of institutions in other European countries, you go there and trades are regarded on a very similar level to white collar jobs, and it doesn't matter whether you're a computer programmer or a craftsman or an engineer or an electrician. And I think it is important, as we were saying, that our children have to be made aware that there are options available to them, and that university is, again, as we were saying, not the only option and not always the best option.
I completely agree with that. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? That, the government has committed to 3 million apprentices by 2020, I think is the figure. They've introduced the apprentice levy. It might be that the law of unintended consequences applies, and that the student loan regime does far more to create 3 million apprentices than the apprentice levy ever will do. I think the kids themselves are very aware of the economic realities, and they're aware that there are alternatives to university. And 2 or 3 of Alex's friends have said, no, university's not the best option for me, and I'll be doing something else.
Final thought from you, Mark. Would you have been just as happy if your kids had gone down, a vocational rather than an academic route? If they'd had an opportunity then to be equally successful down either route?
Okay, so I think it comes back to what's right for the individual child and what's the definition, what's your definition of success for your children. I think for my three, who are all very different, university was the right choice for my three, and I'm not sure that Eleanor will end up using her degree, but she had a very, very good time at university and earned a lot of life skills at university. She ended up social secretary of the hockey club. She was organising dinners for 300 people. That's kind of a skill that you can take into the workplace. It's not necessarily academic, but it's a sort of skill that you can take with you. Alex will pursue a different path, and Dan I've already covered. So I think university was right for my three. Had they wanted to do something else, we would have been fine with that. I mean, we've always taken the view that whatever our children want to do is fine, and providing they can argue it through rationally, then we will do whatever we can to support them. And I think that's all you can do.
And I guess that brings us neatly full circle back to our earlier discussion. Success can take many different forms. It just depends what the right choice is for each individual. And I guess on that note, let's declare this discussion a success and draw a line under it while the going is good. So before we go, Mark, it's been a while since we last caught up with you. So what have you been up to recently?
Oh, just finishing the book, Tim. Just finishing the book. I'm pleased to say we now have a publication date, but my goodness, people say that for a man, writing a book is as close as you get to giving birth. And I feel very much the same way.
Well, I guess, in the same way that recent weeks for you have all been about the book, for me, it's all about the blogging conferences at the moment. I think I touched on this last week. I was in Manchester for Blog On last weekend, and I'll be at BML in London this coming weekend, where I think I mentioned last week that I'm up for an award, which I'm 99% certain I won't win, but you never know, right? And that's it for this episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the two of us online. Mark?
Yeah, I'm online on Twitter at Best Dad I Can Be. The website for the book is markrichards.co.uk.
And I'm at Thatcham Dad, and you can find my blog at slouchingtowardsthatcham.com. You can download this podcast on iTunes and Android devices, from our website meettheparentspodcast.com, and also via a variety of podcasting apps. You can follow us on Twitter at Parents Podcast and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. So thanks for listening, and do please join us again next week. Good night.